right now, no one on the Zoom side.
No one's online yet?
No, so if you want to wait just a minute, just to see someone, you can just into like, okay, yeah, someone just joined.
Someone came on?
Yeah.
Okay. So, good morning, everyone. It is Sunday, October 22nd. We are having our Sunday broadcast from Dawn Mountain in Houston, Texas. And we're talking about an introduction to Buddhism. So we've traced out the life of Gautama, Siddhartha Gautama, who goes on to become Shakyamuni Buddha. Scholars date him 483 BC to 563 BC, so a life of about 80 years. At 26, he became disillusioned with his princely life, having seen an old person, a sick person, a dead body, and then a renunciate who looked very inspiring in the sense that the person had dedicated themselves to escaping from the cycle of birth, old age, sickness, and death, which in India at the time was felt to be just ongoing and repetitive unless one did something to free oneself from the cycle. In the Indian systems, they would call that moksha or liberation. And that term is also used in the Buddhist tradition. And so at the age of 32, having wandered and studied meditation and practiced renunciation, the young prince, who's now a renunciate, goes to a small town in northeastern India, the state of what is today Bihar. The town is today called Bodh Gaya, which just literally means become Buddha. Outside the larger town of Gaya. And he sat down. It's typically felt to be the full moon day of the 5th, I think it is, Tibetan month. It's the lunar calendar. And vowed not to get up until he understood things in such a way that he would be free. And that he did. There were a lot of obstacles under the name of maras or demons, maras of desire, maras of violence. The reading we'll talk about today have to do with a variety of maras that are obstacles to religious development, spiritual development. He had a variety of realizations, including seeing how beings acted and were reborn in relationship to their actions. So a thoroughgoing understanding of the laws of karma, but also understood what came to be known as the Four Noble Truths. They're noble insofar as those who actually deeply realize them become ennobled, become special. We've talked about the first two. First is right view, which is really understanding that there are four truths. There's suffering, there's a cause, which is kind of clinging and animosity of a really, really intense sort, which are the fuel in this vision of ongoing rebirth, that there is a cessation to the process, and that cessation can be brought about through practice of specific practices known as the Eightfold Path. So the first of the Eight Folds is right view, and the second is right attitude, which really includes harmlessness, an attitude of renunciation, which in monastics includes celibacy and just eating begged food twice a day, nothing after about midday, aside from maybe some water. An attitude of nonviolence, love, and compassion. So those are the first two, right view and right attitude, and then we move on to right speech. And right speech has four parts to it. Lying, and that's seen to be destructive in human relationships, and in particular, lying about any kind of spiritual accomplishment that you don't have. That's considered, in particular in the spiritual context, a grave form of erroneous behavior. Divisive speech, idle gossip, and harsh speech. I think the ones that are really challenging, they're all challenging. Lying may be challenging, although most people in our modern culture are fairly straightforward. Divisive speech, so Jane tells you something about Judy. If you carry it to Judy, you're kind of creating a division. There may be some circumstances when you need to do that, obviously, but maybe some circumstances where you just are inflaming ill will, and you just refrain from dividing people with information that is not going to be helpful or useful. Idle gossip, that's probably hard for all of us. We probably engage in a lot of that, talking about the news, baseball, sports, who's done what, what's going on with friends, acquaintances, and relatives. I don't think anybody needs to get rigid, but I think it is helpful to look at one's own behavior and see how are we engaging in conversation. How does it affect us? How does it affect others? Is it optimal? Not with a lot of self-criticism, but just, is this the best way for me to be spending my time? And then there's harsh speech. That's really hard for everybody. Most of us, when something doesn't go our way or somebody says something not very nice to us, well, we actually do one of three things. One is we lash out, which is harsh speech. We freeze and or we withdraw. None of which happens to be particularly helpful in developing human relationships. But the lashing out, harsh speech, which usually includes shame and blame, there's something wrong with you, you did bad, you are bad. It's very, very corrosive, it's very, very omnipresent, and it's very, very hard to intervene on for oneself. It's really an area where one's mindfulness comes in handy, and it's helpful for each one of us to be able to be mindful of when we get reactive. In the psychotherapy business, we say dysregulated, but we'll really lose it. And it's hard not to, and it's important, if there is a rupture, to seek repair. That's most ideal. Maybe we get to a point where there are no ruptures in our verbal exchanges, which would be lovely. But if we do get into some kind of nastiness with people we know, very, very important to seek to repair the rupture. So that's right speech. Right action is acting with integrity, honesty, and not harming others. So it's just a general atmosphere of kindness, non-harmfulness, gentleness, kindness. Again, seems like it might be easy, but get on the highway in an urban area and people are expressing road rage left and right. And it's so tempting to want to get involved in, well, they cut me off, I'm going to cut them off. Yeah. Moment to moment, we can be looking at our behavior. Is that going to cultivate harmony, or is it just going to exacerbate reactivity? Right livelihood is choosing a line of work where you're not involved in harming others. Now, people sometimes get very, very legalistic about this. But I think the more important issue is look at the work you're doing and is it harmful? And if it is harmful, can you minimize the harmfulness? So we don't have to get black and white about things, but in general, if we're engaged in any activity, can we minimize harmfulness, maximize helpfulness and kindness? Just going back to right action in terms of action that's kind and helpful and has integrity. I think our Tibetan teacher, Adzon Pela Rinpoche, lives in an area of Tibet which is famous for murderers and robbers. Yikes, murderers and robbers. And there may have been a time when there were parts of this country where murder and robbery was quite prevalent. For the most part, we ourselves don't commit murder and we're not robbers. And we're more or less restrained in our behavior. Most people we know are more or less restrained. But when I think about right action, one thing I like to think about, which is much more challenging, I think, for us in the modern West, is care in our action towards ourselves. Do we know how to take care of ourselves? Do we know how to relax? Do we know how to put our phones away? Do we know how to smell the roses? Do we enjoy with our friends and colleagues? Do we eat well? And do we avoid, in a destructive way, intoxicants or food? Do we take care of our bodies with some form of exercise? Do we beat ourselves up emotionally as opposed to caring for ourselves internally? I think for most people I know, the tradition, if you read it, will talk about love to others, kindness to others, renunciation, towards, clinging to things and holding on to things and getting into really harmful stances. But where I see in our culture room for consideration is, do we know how to ease up on ourselves? Do we know how to not criticize ourselves? Do we know how to have compassion for ourselves? Kind towards ourselves. Very, very important. And challenging. And again, sometimes people, and I've had my periods where I've seen these kinds of guidelines and seen them as kind of hard and fast rules, black and white rules. And I think much more useful to see them as guidelines, as sort of goals for training. And so we're training in our right speech, we're training in better attitudes and actions towards ourselves and others. We're training in right livelihood, so when we take job positions, we consider, is this something that's harmful to others, harmful to me? And are there ways, even if it is, to minimize that? And then we get on to right effort. And it's got 4 pieces to it. One is to take up behavior that is positive, wholesome, initiate things that are wholesome. So we may be starting a practice of meditation. We may be starting to read something that's beneficial. We may be starting a new career. We may be starting a new diet. We may be starting a regimen of exercise. We may take on a religious practice and starting it. So we're initiating something that's wholesome. That's right effort. And once one has initiated it, there's continuing it, there's maintenance. Making a change is one thing, and sustaining a change is another. And so those are 2 positive aspects, right effort. With respect to negativity, right effort is abstaining from things that are harmful, ceasing. So, today I didn't smoke. So, starting something positive. Sustaining, abstaining from negativity is the second part of right effort, maintaining something that's abstaining from negativity. I'm abstaining from certain intoxicants that I've been using a lot. Okay, that's right effort. In talking about right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, I like to think about this book, which is entitled Changing for Good. It's by an author named James Prochaska. And what Prochaska looked at was how people actually change. How do people literally stop smoking? How do people go on diets? How do people start exercising? And he's a psychologist, but he decided not to look at any particular school of psychology, but really just at the real humans and what were the processes that people go through in taking on change. And it turns out it's a very interesting process, and if you're contemplating doing something different in your life, I'd actually recommend reading this, because he outlines all the supports that go into the stages of change. And the stages involve a point where you've never thought about changing, a stage where you're really seriously contemplating it. Then there's the preparation, then there's the actual change, and then there's the maintenance. So here too, there's the moving towards something positive and maintaining it, or abstaining from something negative and maintaining it. Those are the last two of his processes of change. In our culture, there's a way in which we tend to have this strange image of lifting oneself up by one's own bootstraps, which is a very strange image anyway. But there's a lot of autonomy that people get into when undertaking some change. And change really involves processes of cognition, learning, which, if we translate that into the three jewels, that would be the Dharma. You can get cognitive support for understanding the process of change with respect to Buddhism through study of the Dharma. There are emotional supports that can be very, very useful. And those can be available through inspiring teachers, inspiring books. Classically, there's a whole body of literature, for example, in Tibetan Buddhism, which is called liberation stories, which we would say are biographies. But interestingly enough, in Tibetan, they're called tales of liberation. But if one reads the stories of teachers and advanced students, it can be very, very inspiring, or sees movies about inspiring spiritual figures. It can be very, very inspiring to our practice. One can contemplate the cost-benefit analysis, which includes really, really being sober about, okay, I go out and drink with my friends. What's the benefit? It's social. I'm with friends. I'm maintaining my friends, my society. I feel good. Those are benefits. You've got to be honest. Drinking is a really sweet social connection if you do it socially. What's the cost? Well, depending on how much I'm drinking, it may be doing stuff to my liver, to my throat. If I really get seriously intoxicated, maybe I have a couple of DUIs. Maybe I have a family that I'm not looking after. Maybe I'm not eating properly. How do we feel about these choices? They're real. Most people who talk about change will kind of just praise the fact that they want to do this positive thing, but not really look at the positives associated with the negative things that they're doing. And I think one great thing about this changing for good is that it's very sober about, most of our negative behaviors have a lot of positivity associated with them. And if we're going to give them up, got to really think carefully. What's the cost of giving it up? What's the benefit? I scream when I get into an argument. There's this feeling of discharge and energy. Feels kind of cool. I feel strong. In the moment, it feels like some sort of relief. What's the cost? Well, my partner typically takes 4 days to get over it, if at all, and they sort of keep getting this kind of feeling of distrust towards me that gets deeper and deeper and deeper after I've screamed at them. How do I weigh those out? For any one of us looking at human change, the big issue is what in the psychotherapy business we call homeostasis. Things like to stay the same. Most of us don't like to do things differently. Maybe there's few amongst us who are kind of adventuresome and want to do something different every day. That's a very maybe particular almost type of person. But then even that becomes homeostatic. But, I love to have my coffee and a cigarette in the morning. I have that coffee and then I have this cigarette. And I drink my coffee. It's great. If I give up either one of them, it really feels like, look at your actual lives and think about what it is you're interested in changing, and look at how much, dare I call it, dull pressure there is to keep on keeping on. Keep on keeping on. There's a rule of, I like to call them rule of training in Buddhism. Most people say don't steal, but it's really don't take what is not given. So there you are in the airport, and there's a newspaper sitting on a seat. Nobody gave it to you. Do you pick it up? Do you consider it, it's not given. I'm not going to take it. It's interesting just to even begin to think about, certainly if I'm in somebody's house and there's a nice piece of furniture or a tchotchke that I like, they have a wonderful chime, it's not given, but I take it. We clearly understand that's not given and I take it. That's stealing. But what about other stuff? Just to think about. So again, I think it's most useful to see these as guidelines for training ourselves right speech. How hard it is to change our modes of speaking, our styles of, our habits of speech, action, even being a little bit kinder to the checkout people at the grocery store. It's a major something. It's kind of minor activity, but to change what we normally do to, thank you for your service. Right livelihood. So I bring a higher level of kindness to what it is that I do. And right effort. Optimizing and maintaining the positive changes we make, and optimizing, refraining from negativity, negative things in our lives, and sustaining that, refraining. Things to contemplate. So with that, we come to the end of our talk on Introduction to Buddhism, and Paolo is going to lead our meditation this Sunday morning. So I will move away from the microphone.
Good morning.